The rain poured down in sheets, battering the windows of the small, modest apartment. Emma sat on the couch, her eyes blank as she stared out at the storm. Her 5-year-old son, Tyrell, sat beside her, clutching a stuffed bear to his chest, his big brown eyes wide and filled with innocence. It wasn't that Emma didn't want to smile for him, to reassure him that everything was going to be okay. She desperately wanted to. But there were days when the weight of it all crushed her spirit so deeply that all she could do was hold him and pray for a miracle. She had never imagined her life would turn out like this. Just 3 years ago, she had been working a stable job as a legal assistant in a downtown office. She was good at what she did, smart, ambitious, and proud to provide for her son. But one fateful day, her world crumbled. The firm had folded, like so many others in the wake of the recession. The word layoff had come as a cold, indifferent slap. They couldn't afford her salary anymore, and that was that. Within weeks, she was out of a job, and with it, her security. The initial shock had been manageable. She cashed in her savings, tightened her belt, and kept going. She found odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, whatever she could scrape together. But the bills piled up. The rent was overdue. The car had been repossessed. Each time she thought she had hit rock bottom, life seemed to dig a little deeper, pulling her further into the abyss. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the feeling of failure that gnawed at her, a silent shame that told her she wasn't doing enough. And Tyrell, he deserved better than this. Tonight, she had sat down at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the bills that had been sitting there for days, each one marked with "Final Notice." Her stomach churned. She couldn't keep up. She knew she would have to face the inevitable soon. The eviction. The thought of her son coming home to an empty apartment, his small face confused and heartbroken, haunted her every waking moment. She had no one to turn to. Her parents had died when she was young, and her family was scattered, each one caught up in their own struggles. The friends she had once relied on for comfort had long since disappeared, too wrapped up in their own lives to even notice she was falling apart. It wasn't their fault. Life had a way of doing that to people, pushing them so hard that they stopped noticing the pain of others. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10 at night. Who could be at the door now? Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. She didn't owe anyone anything, except maybe the landlord. Could he have come by to make sure she was still here? Reluctantly, she stood up and made her way to the door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. When she opened the door, there was no one there, just a small envelope on the doorstep. She bent down, picked it up, and examined the thick, cream-colored paper. No return address, no indication of who it was from. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be the landlord? A final warning. But something about it didn't feel right. With a sense of unease creeping up her spine, Emma opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper folded in half. She unfolded it carefully and read the contents, her pulse quickening as she absorbed the words. Emma, you don't know me, but I've been watching you. I see the struggle, and I see the strength in you. This is not a loan, and it's not charity. This is an opportunity for you to turn things around, but it requires faith. If you want out of this situation, you need to meet me tomorrow at the corner of Maple and 5th at 9 a.m. Don't tell anyone. Just come alone. You will know who I am when you get there. The letter was signed with a single letter, J. Emma stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Was this some sort of prank? A scam? Or worse, a trap? She didn't have time for games, not when her son's future was hanging in the balance. But as she looked down at the paper, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, sparked inside her. Could this be real? Could this be the miracle she'd been praying for? The words faith and opportunity stuck in her mind like a song, repeating over and over. What if this was her chance to escape the cycle of misery she had been trapped in? She glanced at Tyrell, sleeping soundly on the couch. His breathing was soft, peaceful. In that moment, Emma made up her mind. She would go. She would go to this meeting. And if nothing came of it, she could at least say she had tried everything. The next morning, Emma woke early, her stomach churning with nervous anticipation. She dressed in the best clothes she had left, a faded pair of jeans, an old sweater, and the same sneakers she'd worn for the past year. There was no time for anything fancy. She didn't want to appear desperate, but she certainly wasn't going to show up looking like she had nothing to lose. Tyrell was still asleep when she left. She kissed his forehead quietly, leaving a note on the kitchen table. "Be back soon. Love you." As she walked to the corner of Maple and Fifth, Emma felt a strange mix of hope and anxiety. The streets were eerily quiet for a morning, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her mind replayed every possible scenario, from the absurd to the terrifying. What if she walked into a trap? What if this was some sort of cruel joke? But she couldn't afford to ignore the possibility that it might be real. When she reached the corner, she saw no one. Just the empty streets stretching out before her, the distant hum of traffic from a few blocks away. She looked around, wondering if she was early. She checked her watch. It was exactly 9 a.m. She stood there for what felt like an eternity. But no one appeared. She was about to turn and leave when a shadow fell across the street. She froze. From across the street, a tall figure emerged from an alleyway. The man was dressed in a sharp black suit, his face hidden beneath the brim of a fedora. He walked with purpose, his steps slow but confident. As he approached her, Emma's heart skipped a beat. Was this him? The mysterious Jay? "Are you Emma?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. "Yes," she replied, her voice tight. The man looked her up and down, as if appraising her. Emma couldn't read his expression, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. "Follow me," he said, without another word. She hesitated for just a moment, then nodded and followed him. They walked in silence, the man leading her through a maze of narrow streets until they reached a building she hadn't noticed before. It was an old, abandoned office building, its windows boarded up, its brick facade cracked and weathered. The man stopped at the door and turned to face her. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice low and serious. "But before I tell you what it is, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Emma felt a wave of doubt wash over her, but then she thought of Tyrell, of everything she was fighting for. She couldn't afford to turn back now. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning inside her. The man nodded once and opened the door, revealing a dimly lit hallway. As he stepped aside, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit corridor that stretched into the shadowed interior of the building. Emma hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But something inside her, something that had been buried beneath layers of disappointment and fear for so long, urged her to take that next step. Her breath caught in her throat as she crossed the threshold. The man, who had not yet spoken a word since their initial exchange, moved smoothly past her, his presence almost too quiet. Emma glanced at him, noticing that he didn't seem at all concerned about the eerie surroundings. His steps were sure, unhurried, as if he belonged here, as if he had walked through this building 100 times before. His calm demeanor only heightened her unease. What kind of person walked into a place like this as if it were a familiar home? She followed, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of dust and disuse, and the silence wrapped around her like a blanket. She caught fleeting glimpses of peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster. The building seemed abandoned, forgotten by time. But there was something about the man, something in the way he carried himself, that suggested this was no ordinary place. It was deliberate, precise, and possibly dangerous. They arrived at a door near the end of the hallway. The man stopped before it and knocked twice, sharp, deliberate raps. Emma's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if she should be frightened or intrigued, but the familiar feeling of dread began to coil in her stomach. What had she gotten herself into? The door opened silently, revealing an office that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A heavy desk stood in the center of the room, papers stacked neatly beside it. A leather chair pushed back slightly as if it had been occupied only moments before. The walls were lined with bookshelves, though the books themselves appeared to be little more than forgotten relics. The room smelled of old leather and wood, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the hallway outside. Behind the desk sat a man who couldn't have been much older than 40. His face was sharp, defined, with eyes that gleamed with intelligence, and something else, something hard. His suit was immaculate, dark gray with a faint pinstripe. He rose as they entered, his movements smooth, almost practiced. "Emma," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Please, come in. Sit down." Emma stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with growing suspicion. She had no idea who this man was, or what he wanted from her. The mystery of the situation gnawed at her. What could this stranger possibly offer that would be worth the risk? The man motioned to the chair in front of the desk. Reluctantly, Emma took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her nerves rattling against the stillness of the room. The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he studied her. There was no kindness in his gaze, only an intense, calculating interest, as if he was sizing her up, deciding whether she was worthy of whatever was about to come next. "I know this is strange," he began, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "And I understand why you're cautious. But trust me when I tell you, I'm not here to hurt you. In fact, I'm here to help you." Emma raised an eyebrow, disbelief flooding her chest. Help her? She didn't know if she should laugh or cry. People didn't just show up offering help without expecting something in return. And she had learned the hard way that nothing came without strings attached. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She wasn't about to let her guard down completely. She had been burned too many times. The man didn't flinch. He regarded her silently for a moment, his sharp eyes piercing. Then he leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "There's something you should know about me, Emma," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "I have the means to change your life, to give you everything you've ever dreamed of. But first, I need you to understand one thing." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. This was it, the moment where everything she'd been fighting for, the promise of something better, either came to fruition or fell apart. "Life is about choices," the man continued, his voice carrying an unsettling calmness. "You've spent years making decisions to survive, to get by. But now, it's time to make a choice that will change everything." Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? What kind of choice?" The man stood up and walked over to the bookshelves, running a finger along one of the dusty spines before pulling a book free. It was a large leather-bound tome, its cover embossed with intricate symbols Emma didn't recognize. He turned and held it out to her. "This is more than just a book," he said. "It's a key to a world of opportunities you've never imagined." Emma took the book hesitantly, turning it over in her hands. The weight of it seemed oddly comforting, though its meaning eluded her. She had no idea what he was talking about, or why he was giving her such an unusual object. But something about it intrigued her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "My name is Julian, and I want you to succeed, Emma. I want you to get out of this life. The struggles, the pain, the constant feeling of being stuck. It doesn't have to be this way. But you have to trust me. You have to accept the opportunity I'm offering." Emma's heart raced in her chest. It felt too easy, too good to be true. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that this was the break she had been waiting for. But years of disappointment and hardship had taught her one thing. If something sounded too good to be true, it probably was. "Why me?" she asked, finally managing to speak through the lump in her throat. "Why are you offering this to me? I'm just a single mother. I'm nothing special." Julian's expression softened ever so slightly, but his eyes still gleamed with a strange intensity. "You are more than you think, Emma. I've been watching you for a long time. I've seen your struggle. I've seen your potential. There's something in you, something powerful, but you've been afraid to embrace it. You've been held back by fear, by doubt." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. He was right, in a way. She had spent so much of her life trying to survive, trying to keep her son safe, that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. She had forgotten what it meant to truly live, to take risks, to believe that something better was possible. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want me to do?" Julian smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the cold, detached smile of someone with ulterior motives. It was knowing, almost sympathetic. "Emma, you don't have to do anything right now, but I want you to take this book. I want you to read it. And when you're ready, when you understand what it means, come back to me. The choice is yours. You can walk away and go back to your old life, or you can step into a new world, a world where you are no longer powerless." The words settled in Emma's mind like a seed, uncertain at first, but growing with each passing moment. The possibilities were vast. The idea of leaving her old life behind, of breaking free from the weight that had kept her down for so long, was intoxicating. But what if it was a trap? What if this man was using her, playing with her emotions? She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not after everything. But then she thought about Tyrell. She thought about the life she wanted to give him, the future she dreamed of for him. She had spent so many years surviving, fighting just to keep going. But had she really lived? Had she really taken the chance to make something of herself, to embrace the opportunities that came her way? She looked up at Julian, who was watching her with a calm patience. The decision lay before her. This moment, this choice, would define the path she took from here on out. Without a word, Emma stood up. She held the book close to her chest, feeling its weight, feeling the power it seemed to promise. "I'll come back," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "when I'm ready." Julian nodded, his eyes flickering with approval. "I'll be waiting." As she left the room, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn. Whether for better or worse, she couldn't say. But one thing was certain. Everything was about to change. Emma left the old building with the weight of the leather-bound book in her arms, the thrum of its promise reverberating through her chest. She felt a sense of urgency, like a door had just cracked open in her life, and she was standing on the threshold of something monumental, though the path forward was still cloaked in shadows. The street outside was busy with the usual hum of the city, the sounds of honking horns, chattering pedestrians, and the occasional screeching brakes faded into the background as Emma clutched the book closer to her. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, though she didn't know if they were watching her with the same intensity she felt from Julian. It was almost as if the weight of the book made her stand out, as if it marked her as different. She wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the strange heaviness of the book, or the overwhelming sensation that her life, as she had known it, had already begun to change. She knew that she should go home. She should go back to her small apartment, to her son Tyrell, to the mundane rhythms of her life, and pretend nothing had happened. But the book in her arms called to her, beckoning her to do something, to embrace the unknown. What if it held the key to everything she had dreamed of? What if it could change her life in ways she never thought possible? The idea was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. She didn't open the book right away. She couldn't bring herself to. There was too much uncertainty, too much fear of what might happen if she did. She had always been cautious. Too cautious, maybe. Her life had been about survival, about getting by. She had learned early on to hold her cards close, to never reveal too much, to protect herself from disappointment, from being hurt. But what if she had been protecting herself from the wrong thing? What if the real risk was never taking the chance to truly live? Tyrell. That was all that kept her grounded. Everything she did, every decision she made, was for him. She wanted a better life for him, a future free from the struggles she had faced. She wanted him to grow up in a world where he wasn't judged by the color of his skin or the poverty of their circumstances. She wanted him to have opportunities, real opportunities, not just survival. When she reached her apartment building, Emma took a deep breath before heading inside. The familiar smell of bleach and old carpet greeted her, and she felt a momentary sense of comfort, though it was tainted by the realization that this place no longer felt like home. She had spent so many years here, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a reminder of everything she had failed to escape, everything she was still trapped in. Tyrell was watching TV when she walked in, his small frame stretched out on the couch, the glow of the screen reflecting in his dark eyes. For a brief moment, the weight of the world lifted from Emma's shoulders as she gazed at her son. He was the only thing that mattered. Everything she did was for him. "Mom," Tyrell said, his voice soft and full of warmth. "You're home early today." Emma forced a smile, but the tightness in her chest remained. "Yeah, I had a little extra time." "How was school?" Tyrell sat up, his feet swinging off the couch. "It was good. We had a math test, but I think I did okay. Can I have some ice cream?" Emma nodded, the routine comfort of their exchange momentarily soothing her nerves. She walked into the small kitchen, the familiar clink of spoons against bowls a reminder of the life they had built together, however modest it was. Tyrell was always so hopeful, so full of optimism. She admired that about him. He didn't seem to see the world the way she did. He wasn't burdened by the weight of their circumstances the way she was. But she couldn't help but wonder, how long would it last? How long before he, too, realized that life wasn't as simple as it seemed? As she spooned out ice cream, her thoughts wandered back to the book Julian had given her. She hadn't even opened it yet, but the longer she waited, the more it gnawed at her, the promise it carried. The question, what if it really could change everything? Tyrell's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, are you okay?" She glanced over at him. His wide eyes were full of concern, and she could see the weight of her unease reflected in his face. She had always tried to shield him from her struggles, but lately it seemed harder to hide her worries from him. He was getting older. He was starting to see things, and she didn't want him to carry any more weight than he already had to. "I'm fine," she said quickly, trying to mask the tightness in her voice. "Just a little tired." "Are you sure? You don't seem fine." Tyrell's gaze was too knowing, too perceptive for his age. Emma put a smile on her face, one she hoped was convincing. "Yeah, I'm sure. Just a lot on my mind." Tyrell nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He reached out and grabbed the remote, flipping through channels without any real interest. Emma felt a pang of guilt. She didn't want her son to carry her burden. He deserved better than that. After dinner, as Tyrell went to bed, Emma sat alone in the living room, staring at the book resting on the coffee table. The words seemed to shimmer in the dim light. She reached out and picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges of the cover. The weight of it felt heavier now, as though it had become a part of her, a symbol of everything she had hoped for and feared. She hadn't even opened it, but somehow it had already begun to shape her thoughts, to pull her in. With a steadying breath, Emma opened the book. The first pages were filled with strange symbols and cryptic words, things she couldn't make sense of, but there was something hypnotic about it, something that kept her from putting it down. She flipped through more pages, her eyes scanning the text, looking for something, anything, that made sense, and then she found it. The words on the page seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive, as if they were calling to her. The key to unlocking your future lies within you. Embrace the power that already resides in your soul. The path forward is not one of ease, but it is the only path to true freedom. Do not fear the choices ahead, for only through choice can you transform your life. The words sent a chill down her spine. They were simple, yet they felt profound, as if the book had been waiting for her to find them. She read them again, her mind racing to understand. What did it mean? Power within her. Choices ahead. Was this some kind of test? Some game that Julian had set up for her? Or was this the real opportunity she had been waiting for? Her pulse quickened as she turned to the next page, her eyes scanning more words, more instructions. This wasn't just a book. It was a guide to something bigger than she had ever imagined. Something that would require more than just courage. It would demand everything from her. For the first time in years, Emma felt a strange sense of clarity, as if everything in her life had led her to this exact moment. She could feel it now, deep inside her. The power Julian had spoken of. The possibility of freedom, of change. But at what cost? The choice was hers. She could walk away from it all, from the uncertainty and the risk. Or she could step into the unknown, embrace the power the book spoke of, and claim the future she had always dreamed of. With trembling hands, she closed the book, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was next, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a spark of hope. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, holding the book against her chest, but when she finally stood up, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not after what she had read. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new risks, and whatever happened, she would face it head-on. For herself, for Tyrell, for the future she could still have. The world had just opened up to her, and she was ready to step into it. Emma awoke the next morning with a sense of urgency coursing through her veins. The events of the previous evening had settled over her like a heavy fog, shrouding her mind in uncertainty, but also in something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The book. The words. The promise of something bigger than herself. She knew that whatever came next, it was going to require all of her courage to move forward, to make the choices that would shape her life from this point on. She stared at the ceiling, the faint light of dawn creeping in through the curtains. The small apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city stirring outside. It was a typical morning, but Emma felt different. The weight of the book still pressed against her chest, its energy pulsing beneath her skin. She could feel its pull even now, as though it were calling her to action. The possibilities it offered seemed endless, but with every possibility came a price, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pay it. But she knew one thing. She couldn't turn back. Her mind raced as she thought about Julian. She still didn't fully understand why he had chosen her, why he had handed her the book, and told her she was special. Maybe he saw something in her that she didn't see herself. Maybe he had a plan for her, a role that she was meant to play. Or maybe it was all part of some larger scheme that she couldn't yet comprehend. Regardless, the one thing that mattered now was her choice. What she did next would determine the course of her life, and Tyrell's. Her eyes moved to the small clock on the nightstand. It was already later than she planned to wake up. Tyrell would be getting up soon, and the usual rush of getting him ready for school would begin. She couldn't afford to lose any more time. If she was going to take the next step, she needed to do it now. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Emma found herself standing in front of the full-length mirror in the hallway, staring at her reflection. She hadn't noticed it before, but today she looked different. Her eyes seemed brighter, more alive. There was a fire in her that she hadn't felt in years. It was as though the weight of her circumstances had been lifted, even if just a little, and in its place was the sense that she could truly change her future. But that meant taking risks. It meant leaving behind the comfort of what she knew. "Mom, are you ready yet?" Tyrell's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned toward the sound of his footsteps as he entered the hallway, dressed for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Emma forced a smile, though it didn't feel as strained as it usually did. "Yeah, I'm ready. Are you all set?" "Yeah, I'm good," he said, adjusting his shoes and looking at her expectantly. "What are we doing after school today?" Emma hesitated, knowing the answer that was bubbling up inside her, the answer she didn't want to speak aloud. She was still trying to convince herself that it was the right thing, that this new path was the one she should take, but deep down, she knew there was no turning back. "We'll see," she replied with a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's just get you to school first, okay?" Tyrell nodded, his innocence shining through it as he grabbed his lunch from the kitchen counter. Emma's heart ached at the thought of him growing up in a world that would never stop challenging him simply because of the color of his skin. But maybe, just maybe, she could change that. If she embraced the power the book had shown her, if she took the chance to reshape her life, maybe she could give him something better, something that wouldn't be dictated by fear or prejudice. They left the apartment together, the cool morning air greeting them as they stepped outside. Emma walked alongside Tyrell, her hand loosely holding onto his as they made their way to the bus stop. The streets were busy, as always, people rushing to work, cars honking impatiently, and the familiar sounds of the city that had become the soundtrack to Emma's life. But today, the noise felt different. It felt distant, almost muffled, as though the world around her was fading, and only her next move mattered. She was stepping into the unknown, and for the first time, it felt like the right thing to do. Once Tyrell was off to school, Emma found herself standing alone at the bus stop, staring down at the book she had placed in her bag. It felt heavier now, more significant, as though it were calling out to her. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she could feel its pull deep within her. The words in the book echoed in her mind, reminding her that the key to unlocking her future was in her hands. But she couldn't wait forever. She had to make a choice. She didn't know how much time had passed when the bus finally pulled up. It was as if she had been standing there for hours, lost in thought. She stepped onto the bus and took a seat by the window, her fingers drumming nervously against her leg. The city passed by in a blur, and Emma's mind kept returning to the same question. What now? The answer came as she stepped off the bus. As she walked toward the office building where she worked, she realized something. She was no longer the same person who had walked out of that building the night before. The person who had accepted the mediocrity of her life, the one who had convinced herself that nothing could change. That person was gone. She had crossed a threshold. Whether she was ready or not, she had set the wheels of change into motion. When she reached the office, the door to her cubicle felt different. It was no longer a door to the place she had spent years of her life trapped in. It was a door to the past, and as she passed through it, she realized that she wasn't going to be coming back. Not in the same way. "Hey, Emma." A coworker called out as she passed by. Emma gave a brief nod, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She barely noticed the sound of the office chatter around her, the clicking of keyboards, the hum of fluorescent lights. It all felt so far away. She was thinking about something else now, something bigger. The path she was on would lead her to a place far beyond these walls. She sat down at her desk, the book still tucked away in her bag. The temptation to open it again was overwhelming, but she resisted. Not yet. She couldn't rush this. She had to be sure that whatever step she took next was the right one. But then the phone rang. The sound of it startled her, snapping her out of her reverie. She picked it up, the voice on the other end familiar but distant. "Emma, it's Julian," the voice said, calm and steady, as if he had been waiting for her to answer. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The chill that ran through her veins wasn't just from the phone call, it was from the realization that the moment had come. Julian had known. He had been waiting for her to make the move, and now it was time to take the next step. The question was no longer whether she was ready. It was whether she had the courage to take it. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. There was a long pause on the other end, as though Julian was sizing her up, deciding whether she was truly ready for what was coming next. "I think you know what comes next," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've made the decision. Now it's time to embrace it. Emma closed her eyes, a wave of emotion crashing over her. There was no turning back now. She had stepped into a world of uncertainty, of risk, but also of possibility. And it was a world she had chosen to be a part of. She didn't know where it would lead her, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore, and she was ready to fight for the life she had always dreamed of. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of new beginnings and difficult decisions. Emma had taken a leap of faith, a step into the unknown that was beginning to feel like the only choice that mattered. Each day she spent grappling with the consequences of the decision she'd made. The more she realized that life was never going to be the same. The book, the words it held, and the mysterious pull it had on her had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of her reality. There was no denying it anymore. The choice she'd made was not only irrevocable, but it was also bigger than she had ever imagined. It started to feel as though the universe itself had shifted beneath her feet. When she closed her eyes, she could see flashes of things that didn't quite make sense. Images, symbols, fragments of a life she hadn't yet lived but was beginning to understand. She knew now that there was power inside her, power that had always been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. But the power was not without a price, and that price had yet to show itself in its full scope. Julian had been in touch almost daily, each conversation more cryptic than the last, but with an underlying current of urgency that kept Emma on edge. He spoke as though he knew exactly what would happen next, and that was both comforting and terrifying. The more she spoke to him, the more she realized how little she actually understood about the world she was stepping into. There were layers to this game she hadn't yet peeled back, and every layer revealed something new and unsettling. But it was clear that Julian was not going to let her back out. His words were not only encouragement, but a reminder of the stakes. "Emma," he said one evening over the phone, his voice a soft echo in the quiet apartment, "the world you're stepping into isn't just about you. It's about more than that. You have a chance to change everything, to reshape what has been broken. But you must act soon, before the window closes. Once it's gone forever." She had never felt so vulnerable and powerful at the same time. She had a mission, a purpose, but no clear path forward. Everything felt like it was on the edge of a precipice, teetering between disaster and hope. But no matter how she tried to avoid it, the question kept creeping into her mind. What was the cost? Days turned into nights, and Emma found herself lost in the depths of her thoughts. Tyrell seemed to notice that something was off, but she did her best to mask it. His innocence and bright optimism were the only things that kept her grounded. He had no idea what she was walking into, nor did he need to. He was just a boy, and Emma knew that no matter what, she had to protect him from the storm brewing on the horizon. He was her anchor in this whirlwind, the only reason she could sleep at night without losing her mind. But even Tyrell couldn't shield her from the weight of the decisions she was making. It was as though she could feel the consequences closing in on her like a storm, waiting to break. It was Friday evening when she finally decided to take the plunge. She had spent the entire day thinking, turning over every possibility, every risk, and every sacrifice in her mind. But something inside her had shifted, something unshakable. She was tired of waiting for permission to live, tired of being a passive player in her own life. She had always told herself that things were impossible, that there were forces outside of her control that dictated her fate. But no more. The book had given her the key to break free, and she was going to use it. Emma sat down at the kitchen table, Tyrell's laughter still echoing in the background as he played a video game. She opened her bag, reaching for the book with trembling fingers. The leather was warm against her skin as she flipped it open. The words on the pages had begun to feel familiar, as though they were speaking directly to her. She ran her fingers over the words, breathing in the energy that seemed to pulse from them. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. "Julian," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "I'm ready." There was a brief pause before his voice crackled through the phone. "Good. I knew you would be. Julian's voice was low, steady, but there was something else in it, something almost predatory. We're running out of time, Emma. You're going to need to make the next move quickly. Trust no one, not even yourself. There are things about this world you haven't even begun to understand. Emma closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She didn't understand much, but there was something undeniably powerful about what she was doing. It was as if every step she took pushed her closer to something she couldn't yet see, but could feel all the same. She stood, her body shaking with anticipation. She had to make a choice. She had to act, before it was too late. With a deep breath, she walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights were fading into the evening, and the familiar hum of traffic was gradually being replaced by the quiet of the night. It felt surreal, as though she were living in a dream, one that could collapse at any moment if she didn't stay awake. But that was the beauty of it, wasn't it? It was a dream, yes, but it was hers to shape. Emma, listen to me, Julian said again, his voice breaking through her thoughts. You have to remember, everything you do from here on out will have consequences. There's no going back once you open that door. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I know. And the people who are watching you. Be careful. There are forces at work that you cannot even imagine. Trust no one. Emma felt a cold chill race down her spine. She had known there were risks, but hearing them aloud made them feel so much more real. I'll be careful, she said, her voice a mix of determination and fear. I won't let anything stop me. Julian's laughter was almost soothing. Good. I'll be in touch. Remember, you're not alone in this. The line went dead, leaving Emma standing there in the growing darkness, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest like an anchor. She turned back to the table, the book still lying open before her. She could feel its power now, an almost palpable energy thrumming through her. The symbols, the words, the strange pull. It was all so much more than she had imagined. She had been right to trust Julian, but the real question was whether she could trust herself. She closed her eyes again and took a deep breath, focusing on the words in front of her. They weren't just words. They were a map, a guide to a future she could not yet fully comprehend. But that was the point, wasn't it? She wasn't supposed to understand it all. Not yet. The journey had only just begun. Her fingers hovered over the page. And then, as though guided by some invisible force, she made the decision. She would take the plunge, embrace the unknown, and follow the path that the book had set before her. The future was unwritten, but she had the pen. The decision was made. Tyrell called out to her from the living room, and for a brief moment, Emma hesitated. The weight of her choice was almost too much to bear. But then, with a deep breath, she closed the book and walked toward the sound of her son's voice. Tomorrow, everything would change. She could feel it in her bones. But for now, she needed to be present for him. The storm could wait. As she stepped into the living room, Tyrell looked up from his game, his smile bright and unburdened by the weight of the world. She returned his smile, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. Tomorrow. Everything would change tomorrow. But tonight, she would hold onto this moment, this fleeting calm, before the storm of what was to come. And she was ready. The following days passed in a blur, a cacophony of noise, tension, and adrenaline, with each moment growing heavier than the last. Emma's decision had been made. There was no turning back now. She had opened the door, and she was stepping into a world she barely understood. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like a relentless tide, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more it consumed her thoughts. But through it all, there was one thing that remained crystal clear. She had taken control of her destiny. And no matter what came next, she would never be the same. It was a Friday when everything truly changed. The sun had barely begun to set, casting long shadows over the city, when Emma received the call. She had been waiting for it, but somehow, when it came, it still took her by surprise. The voice on the other end was familiar, but there was an edge to it now. Something darker, something that hinted at the urgency that was creeping into every part of her life. "Emma." Julian's voice crackled through the phone, low and almost predatory. "You've made your choice. Now, it's time to see it through." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "I'm ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had told herself she was prepared for this, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the depth of what was happening. "You think you are," Julian continued, his tone slightly mocking, but with an edge of respect. "But you're not. Not yet. This is going to be harder than you think. And you need to be prepared for what's coming." His words were like a punch to the gut, but Emma wasn't deterred. She had already made the hardest decision of her life, and there was no turning back now. She had felt the pull of the book, the power that flowed through its pages, and there was no way she could ignore it. Whatever came next, she had to face it head-on. "Tell me what to do," Emma said, her voice steady now, despite the tremor that was creeping into her chest. Julian paused for a long moment, as though considering whether to give her the information she needed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "There's a place, a location. You'll need to go there, but you can't go alone. You can't trust anyone right now, especially not the people you think you can. There are eyes on you, watching your every move." Emma's mind raced as she processed his words. She had felt it, that strange sensation of being watched, of being part of something bigger than herself, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she was powerless, a passive observer in her own existence. But now she was part of something larger. Now she had the power to change the course of everything. "I'll go," she said firmly. "Where is this place?" Julian's voice lowered even further, as if he were sharing a secret, one that was too dangerous to be spoken aloud. "You'll find it in the book. It's marked there, hidden in plain sight. You'll know it when you see it." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she hung up the phone. She felt the familiar pull of the book, its weight like an anchor in her bag, as though it were calling to her. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, the worn leather of its cover feeling cold beneath her fingertips as she opened it once again. The pages seemed to shift before her eyes, the words rearranging themselves as if they were alive, adapting to her needs. And then, just as Julian had promised, she saw it, an address written in a flowing script that seemed to burn with an inner light. She knew without a doubt that this was the place she needed to go. It was time to move. Tyrell was in the living room, absorbed in his video game as usual, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Emma stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, her heart heavy with the knowledge that everything was about to change. She had promised herself that she would protect him, that she would shield him from the darkness that was closing in. But there were things beyond her control now, things that had been set into motion long before she had made the choice to open the book. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet anyway. The time wasn't right. So she did what any mother would do in her position. She kissed him on the forehead, told him she was going out for a bit, and left him with a smile, hiding the fear that was twisting in her stomach. The city outside seemed to be holding its breath as she stepped into the night. The streets were empty, the usual bustle of activity muted by the growing sense of tension in the air. Emma walked quickly, her steps purposeful, her mind focused on the destination ahead. The address from the book had led her to a small alleyway, tucked between two tall buildings. It was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the book had brought her here, and the pull of it was undeniable. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the alleyway. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete, and something else, something faintly metallic that made her skin crawl. She could hear footsteps behind her, a soft shuffle that seemed to follow her every move. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, stretching long in the dim light. She kept moving, her pulse quickening as the alley seemed to narrow, the walls closing in around her. It felt like something was watching, waiting. She could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before her, those who had walked this path and disappeared into the dark. The book had promised her answers, but she was beginning to wonder if she had made a mistake, if she had misjudged everything. Then, as she reached the end of the alley, she saw it. A door, small and inconspicuous, tucked between two dumpsters. It was old, its wood weathered by time and neglect, but there was something about it that felt right. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side, but she had come too far to turn back now. The door creaked open, revealing a small room that smelled of dust and age. The only light came from a single candle burning in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was empty, save for a table in the center. And at that table sat a figure, cloaked in shadows. Emma. The voice spoke, low and gravelly, and Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was Julian's voice, but distorted somehow, as though coming from far away. "Come closer," the figure said. "I've been waiting for you." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the room. She had no choice now but to face whatever came next. The figure in the shadows leaned forward, and for the first time, Emma could see his face. A man, older than she had imagined, with eyes that gleamed like two dark pools. He smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth. It was the kind of smile that made her stomach churn, the kind of smile that promised nothing but danger. "You've made it," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but laced with a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. "But now, the real test begins."